My name is Liam Summers. I live in Seattle, Washington, and I'm fascinated by Cuba. In June of 2019, I traveled to Cuba to film a documentary. My goal for this film was to try to counter the corporate media's narrative of Cuba, because it is almost entirely false, but also to give people an inspiration to fight for Cuba and to fight to end the horrendous blockade of Cuba imposed by the U.S. government.
Is imposing new restrictions on U.S. travel to Cuba. The U.S. will no longer allow group educational and culture trips known as people-to-people travel.
The U.S. government will also ban trips by cruise ships and private air travel.
The Trump administration, they really believe in the power of sanctions to kind of bend what they say are these rogue regimes to their will. Look, we've seen it in Iran with now 26 rounds of sanctions. We've seen it in Venezuela, and we've seen it here in Cuba.
The Trump administration is imposing new restrictions on U.S. travel to Cuba.
The Department of the Treasury will implement further regulatory changes to restrict non-family travel to Cuba.
President Donald Trump. I am announcing today a new policy, just as I promised during the campaign. And I will be signing that contract right at that table in just a moment. Our new policy begins with strictly enforcing U.S. law. We will not lift sanctions on the Cuban regime. We will enforce the ban on tourism. We will enforce the embargo.
Where are we about to go, Doug?
We're heading to Mexico and then to Cuba without a license.
In Cuba, I spent time with and interviewed some of the leaders of the Cuba Solidarity Movement, the people who regularly travel and take groups to Cuba, as well as, when I returned, some of the people who support Cuba from the U.S. I wanted their personal answers of why they think Cuba is so important, so I could create an answer for the question of the documentary, Why Fight for Cuba?
Do you want to... It's a frog. It's a frog inside this. Do you see it? My name is Gail Walker, and I'm the executive director of IFCO, the Interreligious Foundation for Community Organization, and our special project, Pastors for Peace. And I have been traveling to Cuba since 1992. Why Cuba? We think it's important to travel to Cuba. It's important for people to be able to see Cuba, the Cuban reality for themselves. There's so much misinformation about Cuba in the United States, and any of us, older or younger, have been really, indoctrinated about Cuban reality. That there's a dictatorship, that there's no freedom of expression or religion, and that's never to say that Cuba is a utopia. The Cubans will tell you that. And there are challenges, and they're trying to work those challenges out. Our belief at IFCO Pastors for Peace is that we, the United States, and especially the U.S. government, does not have the right to try to dictate to Cuba what it needs to do to make any kind of changes. So it's important to come see the reality for ourselves and make up our own minds. And that's why fundamentally we think it's important to go to Cuba.
Despite the new restrictions, it is still possible to go to Cuba legally. Although myself and many other people in the Cuba Solidarity community believe it is more impactful to go illegally, to not ask for permission, to protest the travel restrictions. This is done by going through a third country like Mexico or Canada.
The travel restrictions have been in place for many years, but it's been a way to, we think, to control the narrative, to control what people think and feel about Cuba. By saying you can't go, we're trying to either intimidate people into not going, or try to control the way that people think and what they think about Cuba. Cuba is the only nation in the world in which there's this kind of consistent, restriction on our ability to go.
Why it's important to travel here is because we get lied to all the time. I don't know who it was, but somebody once said the biggest reason for the travel ban, the biggest reason the U.S. doesn't want us to come here is that we find out within the first 10 minutes that we've been lied to. And we need to come here to find out what's really happening.
What Cuba has managed to accomplish under the circumstances of the blockade is amazing. Their healthcare system is high quality and completely free. They have free education all the way through college, and they have almost no homelessness in their streets. These are all things the United States lacks.
It's like, why in the world do we live the way we live? When we come to Cuba, we are respected. They feed us better than anybody in Cuba eats. And it's to me, it's an honor to come here. It's an honor to be with the people that have been fighting our government for 60 years. And me as a veteran, for my country to tell me I can't come to Cuba, makes me want to come to Cuba more.
My name is Bill Hill. I'm 73 years old. I come from Tucson, Arizona, and this is my 28th caravan to Cuba without a license. The reason that I come without a license is because we believe that getting a license to come to Cuba is kind of like agreeing with the blockade. And I definitely do not agree with the blockade. I'm a Vietnam vet, and my government allowed me to go to Vietnam and kill people, but then they're going to tell me I can't come and visit my friends in Cuba. I have more friends in Cuba than I have in the United States, and nobody can tell me not to come here. And so we come every year without a license, and we say openly that we're not going to abide by the rules of the United States government. The thing that I say to people when I get back home and they ask me about my trip to Cuba is I tell them exactly how people are living here and the effects of the blockade on the people of Cuba, on the country of Cuba not being able to trade with other countries close by. Like, we could trade with Louisiana for rice, but yet Cuba has to buy rice from Vietnam, and they have to pay in American currency because they can't trade with the World Bank. The tourist industry in this country was set up to bring money into the country so that they could trade with other countries that they can trade with to buy the stuff that they need to sustain the revolution.
The reason we call it a blockade and not an embargo is because an embargo is when a country decides to suspend all trade and relations with another country. But what the U.S. is doing to Cuba is not only that, they also put pressure on other countries to suspend trade and relations with Cuba. And because the U.S. is as powerful as it is, that has a major effect on Cuba's ability to trade worldwide. And that's a blockade, and that's what Cuba has had to endure for the last 60 years.
They are a living example of what even an extraordinarily poor country can do when they organize their society in a socialist way under the most difficult circumstances, facing off against the most powerful country in the world that is trying to strangle them. Nonetheless, the Cuban people persevere and they show what can be done with socialism. And that's why the U.S. wants to stop them. That's why the U.S. wants to kill them, because they don't want anyone to see that example. And that's why, for me as a socialist, it's so important to stand in solidarity with Cuba to protect that example as a global example of what socialism can do, even under the most difficult of circumstances.
To see the development despite this really genocidal blockade of not allowing this country to develop, the U.S. government strangling them by denying them medicine, by denying them the right to trade, by internationalizing blockade, and now with Title III of Helms-Burton. I think that the duty, responsibility of the people of the United States is to act more vociferously against the blockade, but also for those who can, to come to Cuba. I think one of the bigger challenges for us today is the financial and commercial power of the U.S. in being able to sanction other countries that do business with Cuba. The problem for us in the U.S. is not knowing the effect of all this, is getting affected by the media lies. Help each other, how to produce video, how to produce material, how to get access to universities, high school, even junior high, how to speak on street corners and say Cuba is not our enemy. Help us break the blockade. Don't jam the offices of Congress people. Let's organize demonstrations. But more than anything, let's fight with our education and help people in the U.S. see there's a better world, not only possible, but a better world that exists already in Cuba. And it's socialism, a system that says we who produce it all should own it and run it all for the benefit of every human being and our environment.
In conclusion, fight for Cuba and fight to end the blockade of Cuba, because Cuba is an example of a new system working people all over the world should be fighting for in their own countries, and proof that small, poor countries can resist U.S. imperialism. And that is exactly why they are a blockaded country, because the U.S. is terrified of what an example of an alternative to their capitalism and an example of a resistance to their imperialism will do to the world. And we need those kinds of examples, those kinds of inspirations, and that's why we need Cuba.
Now just to introduce you this friend group is going to be with us today, ICAP and Cuban Express. El Expreso de Cuba. For you. Si no pueden entender que